Wuthering Waves has some of the strongest emotional storytelling in gacha genre, and few characters prove that more than Phrolova. But ever since her arc dropped, there's been a recurring opinion floating around. She should have stayed dead, or even the story would have been better if the protagonist actually killed her. And today, I want to talk about why I disagree, not just emotionally, but from a storytelling perspective. Because Frolova's arc is actually a great example of how tragic characters should be handled, and why simply killing someone off isn't automatically better writing. There's a right way and a wrong way to use death as a narrative tool, and Frolova shows us where that line is. So first, let's be fair. I understand why some players felt Frolova should have died permanently. The story frames it like a death scene. Rover strikes the final blow, there's emotion, there's tragedy, there's sacrifice. If you pause the story right there, it feels like a perfect ending to a tragic villain. People latched onto that because it's clean and it's familiar. We've seen this trope thousands of times. The broken antagonist is freed by death. So some players assume the rule applies here too. The problem is that trope doesn't actually fit Prolova's character or the themes of Wuthering Waves. Phrolova isn't the monster who needed to be put down. She's a deeply tragic, deeply human character whose entire arc revolves around grief, trauma, and loss, and the consequences of trying to hold on to the past. Her fight with Rover isn't meant to be a mercy killing. It's a turning point, a moment of clarity, and a collapse of everything she was clinging to. And yes, she dies in the moment, but the story doesn't treat her death as the final answer, because thematically speaking, her story was never about dying, it was about letting go. One of the biggest misunderstandings I've seen is this idea that Phrolova coming back somehow ruins the emotion of her death. But she doesn't come back in a cheap way. She doesn't walk out fully healed like nothing happened. Her body is gone, her humanity is fractured, her consciousness exists inside the lost beyond, the same realm that destroyed her life in the first place. This isn't resurrection, it's consequence. Is the story showing us that trauma doesn't vanish just because the character dies? Her pain persists, her regrets persist, her memory persists. This is a far more realistic and far more emotionally grounded than a clean tragic death. There's another argument I've seen a lot, and it's an understandable one. Some players believe Prolova's story could have ended differently if the protagonist had stayed in her life. The protagonist made a promise, they said they would come back, and they didn't. So the idea is, if the protagonist had kept that promise, Phrolova wouldn't have become what she did. And look, I get why people feel this way. The story is written to make you feel bad for her. It is deliberately manipulative in the best way possible. It wants you to ask, what if things had gone differently? But here's where I disagree with the conclusion. Yes, it's possible that the protagonist staying in her life could have helped. It could have given her an emotional anchor. It could have slowed her descent, but it is far from guaranteed, and based on her characterization, it's honestly not the most likely outcome. Pavlova's obsession wasn't born from loneliness alone, it was rooted in grief, in loss, in a refusal to accept reality. Her desire to resurrect her family wasn't a phase, it was her entire reason for existing. Even if the protagonist had stayed, that obsession would still have been there. And this is where I think the community goes a bit too far. I've seen people outright blame or even hate the protagonist for what Phrolova became. And while I do think making that promise and not keeping it was a bad move, the protagonist is not responsible for Phrolova's choices. They met once, they interacted briefly, they shared the moment, not a lifetime. It might sound harsh, but the protagonist did not owe her their entire future. And Phrolova was not a helpless child who needed saving. Which brings me to another argument I've seen, that Phrolova is completely blameless because she was manipulated by Fractidas, the bad guys. And I don't agree with that either. Phrolova is not ignorant, she's not naive, she's extremely intelligent and painfully self-aware. She knew what she was doing, she knew the cost, and she accepted becoming something monstrous to reach her goal. That doesn't make her evil, but it does mean she has agency. And that's what makes her tragic, not innocent. She wasn't dragged into darkness, she walked into it with her eyes open. And here's the key point. If she died permanently, cleanly, neatly, that would have been lazy. Why? Because killing a character is the easiest way to create emotion. is the storytelling equivalent of pushing a big red button labeled "Sad Now." It's dramatic, sure, but it doesn't always mean anything. Frolova's survival is messier, which is exactly why it's better. It allows for lingering emotional consequences, unresolved conflict, thematic continuation, and a future role in the protagonist's arc. Her existence in The Lost Beyond isn't a mistake, it's a world building and a character building working together. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about Frolova. This is about how death should work in storytelling. Period. Personally, I don't believe a character that has meaning just because it's sad, shocking, or permanent. For that to matter in a story, someone has to achieve something through it. That someone can be the character who dies, the character who causes the death, or even a third party. But something must be gained: knowledge, resolve, transformation, consequence, escalation. If a character dies and nothing fundamentally changes afterwards, no arc resolves, no theme deepens, no future conflict is shaped, then the death isn't meaningful. It's just aesthetic tragedy. And this is exactly why I don't think Prolova staying dead would have improved the story. Her permanent death wouldn't have achieved anything that her continuous existence doesn't already accomplish. And in fact, it would have closed off far more narrative potential than it created. So when should you kill a character, and when should you let them live even if they're broken? There's a simple principle: a character death should serve the story, not replace the story. Prolova's permanent death would have been a replacement for depth. Her continued existence creates depth. Good storytellers don't kill characters for shock value. They kill them when the narrative truth demands it. And in Prolova's case, her death wasn't truth. Her tragedy is ongoing, and that's what makes her compelling. So why did the community split so hard on this? Because many players subconsciously apply a rule from other media. A tragic villain must die for the story to feel complete. But Wuthering Waves isn't following that formula. It's writing trauma the way trauma actually behaves. It lingers, it haunts, it refuses to die neatly. Phrolova is one of the game's strongest emotional characters because she breaks the trope instead of repeating it. Frolova's story works because it's imperfect, because it's uncomfortable, because it doesn't wrap everything up in a clean tragic bow. Not all villains need redemption, not all villains need death, some need something more powerful, a chance for the story to keep digging into who they are and who they used to be. And honestly, Phrolova is one of the few gacha characters who feel like she deserves that kind of complexity. I'm glad she didn't stay dead, and the story is stronger because of it. If you like videos that dig deeper into storytelling, character arcs, and narrative decision in gacha games, then stick around. This is exactly the kind of thing I want to explore on this channel. Let me know in the comments, did you think Phrolova should have stayed dead, or do you prefer the direction Wuthering Wave chose? Either way, her story isn't over, and neither is ours.